The late afternoon sun bathed the city streets in a soft golden glow after months of service overseas. Colonel Victoria Mason decided to treat herself to a quiet dinner at one of the city's most elegant restaurants. At 55, she still had the energy and vigor of someone half her age, her military discipline evident in her every move. Stepping out of her modest car, she walked across the sidewalk, her sneakers clicking lightly on the pavement as she approached the entrance. Victoria wasn't one for grand guest. She wasn't here to flaunt her accomplishments or to attract attention. She simply wanted a peaceful evening, a break from the demands of her career. The restaurant, with its crystal chandeliers and soft classical music, was the perfect setting for a quiet night. The tables were neatly arranged, each one dressed in white linen, and the atmosphere was serene. She chose a small table by the window where she could enjoy the view of the city's skyline as the sun set. As she sat down and opened the menu, she knew exactly what she wanted: a medium-rare steak and a glass of red wine. She didn't need anything fancy, just a good meal and some time to unwind. However, as she sat there waiting, something felt off. She couldn't ignore the group of affluent diners at a nearby table, their whispered conversations loud enough for her to hear. The way they looked at her, scrutinizing, disapproving, made it clear that she didn't quite fit in here. They were all white, well-dressed, and exuded wealth, while she and her simple attire clearly didn't match their expectations. Despite their clear disdain, Victoria remained composed. She'd faced worse in her career, where she had often been the target of prejudice and discrimination. She knew how to handle judgment tonight. However, she wasn't here to fight battles. She just wanted her steak. When the waiter arrived, his attitude was less than professional. He barely smiled, his tone distant as he asked, "What can I get for you?" Victoria, not allowing herself to be bothered, placed her order calmly: a medium-rare steak and a glass of red wine. "Please." He nodded curtly and left without another word. She returned her attention to the menu, trying to relax, but the tension in the air was palpable. The whispers continued from the nearby table, and though she tried to ignore them, she couldn't help but hear a few snide remarks about her presence. "Look at her dressed like that," one of them said, just loud enough for Victoria to catch the words. Victoria's gaze remained steady, though she didn't react. Instead, she focused on her meal, hoping it would arrive soon. 10 minutes passed, then 20, still no food. As the wait dragged on, she became more aware of how the minutes seemed to stretch longer than they should. The other tables, including those who had arrived after her, were being served. Finally, she caught the attention of the waiter. "Excuse me?" she said, her voice calm but firm. "My meal hasn't arrived yet. Is there a problem?" The waiter glanced at her with an irritated sigh. "The kitchen's busy. You'll have to wait a bit longer." He walked off without waiting for her to respond. The minutes dragged on. Victoria glanced at her watch. Almost 30 minutes had passed since she placed her order. The restaurant was busy, but it didn't make sense that her meal had been delayed for so long. Around her, the other guests were being served promptly, enjoying their meals while she sat alone waiting. The whispers from the group of diners at the nearby table hadn't stopped either. Now their voices were louder, more deliberate. Victoria could hear them discussing her, some of the words barely audible but unmistakable in their meaning. "Why would someone like her even come here?" one of them muttered, just loud enough for Victoria to hear. "This place isn't for people like her." The words stung, but Victoria refused to show any emotion. She had long learned how to block out hate. She had faced it throughout her military career, where the color of her skin and her gender had often made her a target. But tonight she had hoped for something different, a quiet evening, a moment of peace. But peace seemed to be slipping through her fingers. She raised her hand again, signaling the waiter this time when he approached. His face showed clear annoyance. "What is it now?" he asked, his tone less than respectful. "My meal has been delayed long enough," Victoria said, her voice calm but firm. "I've been waiting for almost 40 minutes. This isn't acceptable." The waiter sighed and looked around clearly, not wanting to engage. "The kitchen is backed up. There's nothing I can do about it. You'll have to wait." He turned to walk away, without giving her a chance to speak further. Victoria was no stranger to delays. She understood that sometimes things went wrong in a busy kitchen, but the dismissive attitude and the sense that she was being deliberately ignored were different. She wasn't just another customer, she was a military officer who had earned her place in society through years of service and sacrifice. She had every right to expect decent service before she could think about whether or not to escalate the situation. The group of diners at the nearby table erupted into snickers. One of them, a man in his mid-40s, stood up and deliberately bumped into her table as he passed. His eyes met hers, and a smirk tugged at the corners of his mouth. "Maybe if you weren't dressed like you're here for a fast food joint, you'd be treated better," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. Victoria felt her blood begin to boil, but she kept her composure. She took a slow, deliberate breath, refusing to let him get under her skin, but this time she wasn't going to let it slide. She had the right to stand up for herself. She stood up from her seat, her chair scraping against the floor. The waiter was still at the counter chatting with another employee, clearly not paying attention to her. Victoria took a deep breath, then walked to the front desk where the manager stood. "I need to speak to the manager," she said, her voice sharp. The manager turned a polite smile on his face, but it faded when he saw the look in her eyes. "Is there a problem, ma'am?" he asked, his tone suddenly more cautious. "Yes," she said firmly. "I've been waiting for my meal for nearly 40 minutes, and on top of that, I've been disrespected by both your staff and some of your guests. This is unacceptable." The manager's polite expression faltered as Victoria spoke. He looked around the restaurant, his eyes shifting nervously to the group of diners at the nearby table, then back to Victoria. It was clear he understood what she was saying, but he didn't seem eager to get involved. He glanced briefly at the waiter who had noticed the shift in atmosphere and was now hovering awkwardly by the counter. "I'm very sorry for the delay, ma'am." The manager said, his voice a little too rehearsed. "There's nothing more I can do right now, the kitchen is backed up." But Victoria cut him off, her voice sharp. "I don't care about your excuses. I've been waiting longer than anyone else in this restaurant, and your staff has treated me with open disrespect. This isn't about a delayed meal anymore. It's about how I'm being treated." She didn't raise her voice, but there was an undeniable authority in her tone, one that spoke of years of experience dealing with far more complicated situations than this one. The manager hesitated for a moment, glancing at the group of diners who were now watching the scene. With wide eyes, some of them had already started whispering to each other, and Victoria could feel their judgment, their silent condemnation. "Ma'am, I understand you're upset," the manager said, but Victoria was no longer interested in hearing his apologies. She'd had enough of being ignored, of being marginalized, of being treated like she didn't belong. "No, she said firmly, her voice cutting through his feeble attempt to plate her. "I'm not just upset, I'm insulted. You and your staff need to understand that there is no excuse for the way I've been treated tonight." The waiter, who had been standing in the background, suddenly approached. "Ma'am," he said, his voice defensive, "you don't have to make a scene if you don't like the service. You can leave." Victoria's eyes locked onto his with a cool, unflinching gaze. His words hit her like a slap, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she stood straighter, drawing on the strength of her military training. "I'm not leaving. I've paid for this meal, and I have every right to be treated with respect. You don't get to decide who belongs here based on what I look like or how I'm dressed." The atmosphere in the restaurant had shifted. The once bustling space now felt tense, charged with an undercurrent of discomfort. The group of diners who had been whispering were no longer laughing or mocking her. Instead, their faces were a mix of curiosity and unease. Victoria could feel their eyes on her, but she refused to let their discomfort sway away. She had nothing to be ashamed of. The waiter, clearly rattled by her unyielding composure, looked at the manager, but the manager, still trying to diffuse the situation, didn't move. Victoria's patience was wearing thin, and she knew she had reached her limit. "If you're not going to do anything about this," she said, her voice cold, "I'll take it to the next level. I'll call the authorities." The words hung in the air, heavy and unwavering. It was then that a new voice joined the conversation. A man in a police uniform who had been sitting at a table nearby stood up and walked toward her with a stern expression. His uniform was neat, his posture rigid, as though he believed his presence alone would immediately restore order to the situation. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his eyes scanning Victoria and the manager, his tone authoritative. The other diners fell silent, watching the unfolding drama with rapt attention. Victoria didn't back down. "Yes," she said, her voice steady. "There is a problem. I've been disrespected by your staff, and I've had enough." The officer's eyes narrowed as he assessed the situation, clearly not wanting to get involved in any sort of conflict. "I don't like the sound of this. What seems to be the issue?" He asked, his voice hard, as though he was already prepared to side with the restaurant. Victoria's eyes locked with his. "I'm simply asking for what I'm owed, a meal, and the respect every paying customer deserves, but instead, I've been treated like an outsider. I'm not leaving until this is resolved." The officer's expression hardened clearly, uncomfortable with the confrontation. He crossed his arms over his chest. "It sounds like you're causing trouble. I need to see some identification." Victoria's eyes flicked to the officer's face as he demanded her identification. She could feel the tension in the air, the weight of every eye in the room turning toward her, waiting for her response for a moment. She considered ignoring the officer's request, but she knew better. This wasn't just about her meal anymore. This was about standing her ground, about showing that she wouldn't be intimidated into submission. With a steady hand, Victoria reached into her purse. Her movements slow and deliberate, the officer's eyes followed her every action, his posture rigid and expectant. She could sense the growing unease around her, the subtle shift in energy as the diners began to realize that this wasn't just another customer complaint. When Victoria pulled out her wallet, she didn't just show him a credit card or a driver's license. Instead, she slid a military identification card across the table. It was a simple card, but its significance was undeniable. The officer's eyes immediately dropped to the card, and for the first time, a flicker of hesitation crossed his face. Victoria watched him as his fingers fumbled slightly, unsure of how to react. The once arrogant stance he had adopted. Ed now seemed hollow, replaced with uncertainty. She didn't need to say a word. Her uniform, her rank, the history of service behind her, these things spoke for her, but she did speak, her voice clear and resolute. "My name is Colonel Victoria Mason, United States Army. I've served this country for over 30 years, defending the rights and freedoms of every citizen, regardless of who they are or where they come from." Her voice was calm, but the weight of her words was unmistakable. "I don't need to prove anything to you, but if you want to understand who you're addressing here—" "It is?" The officer looked at the card in his hand, his face paling as the realization set in. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. The arrogance that had been so apparent in his posture and voice evaporated in an instant around the room. A murmur began to ripple through the other diners. Eyes widened, and the group of white guests who had been the source of so much discomfort fell silent. Some even seemed to shrink back, embarrassed by the turn of events. Victoria's calm confidence had shifted the dynamic in the room, and the tables had turned in a way that no one had anticipated. The officer stood frozen, unable to find an excuse for his earlier behavior. It wasn't just the identification that had caught him off guard, it was the realization that he had just tried to intimidate someone who had served their country with honor, someone who had spent her life protecting the very rights he had been sworn to uphold. Victoria, still standing, met his eyes with a sharp, unyielding gaze. "Is this how you use your authority?" she asked, her tone cutting through the tension. "You threaten a woman, an officer in the United States Army, simply because she asked for basic respect. Is this what you believe justice looks like?" The officer's face flushed red, but no words came. Victoria wasn't waiting for an apology. She didn't need one. She wasn't interested in the empty words that would only serve to plate her. What mattered now was accountability. "Call your superior," Victoria said, her voice unwavering. "I want this handled properly, and I want this behavior addressed." For a long moment, the officer hesitated, clearly unsure of how to proceed, but the weight of her words hung in the air, and he finally nodded, his jaw clenched as he turned to walk away. Victoria didn't move. She didn't need to. The situation had already shifted, and now it was up to the restaurant and the police to deal with the consequences of their actions. Victoria stood tall, unshaken, as the officer hurried off to make the call. The air around her felt thick with tension, as if everyone in the restaurant was holding their breath, waiting for the next move. For the first time that evening, she allowed herself a brief moment of satisfaction. She wasn't about to back down. not when it was clear that her dignity had been put on trial by people who thought they could push her around. The officer returned to the table minutes later, this time accompanied by a man in a dark blue suit, his stern face and the silver bars on his shoulder marking him as someone with authority. The new arrival was clearly a higher-ranking officer, and Victoria knew this was the person she had been waiting for. The officer in the suit approached her and stopped a few paces away. His eyes were sharp and his stance was formal, but Victoria could sense a flicker of unease in him. "Colonel Mason." He began, his voice low and controlled. "I'm Sheriff Richard Moore. I've been made aware of what's happened here, and I want to assure you that we'll take immediate action." Victoria didn't say a word, but her eyes never left his. She had heard enough empty apologies in her life to last a lifetime. What mattered now was whether this man would put his words into action. Sheriff Moore nodded toward the officer who had first confronted her, the young cop whose face was still red with embarrassment. The sheriff's expression softened, but his words were stern. Officer James stepped forward. The young officer hesitated, his hands twitching nervously by his sides. When he finally spoke, his voice was strained, almost inaudible. "Sheriff, I didn't mean to. No excuses." Sheriff Moore interrupted, his tone unwavering. "You overstepped your authority. You humiliated this woman, a citizen of this country, for no reason other than your own prejudice." The officer lowered his gaze, his face a mix of guilt and fear. It was clear he had no defense for his actions. Victoria, watching the scene unfold, finally spoke. Her voice was calm, but it carried the weight of years of service, of everything she had fought for. "I don't need your apology, Officer James," she said, her eyes locking with his. "What I need is for this to never happen again to anyone." The sheriff turned to the manager of the restaurant, who had been standing nearby, clearly uncomfortable. "I will be looking into this matter as well, the way your staff has treated this woman." He cut off as if realizing there was no need to continue. It was obvious to everyone what had been done, understood. The manager mumbled, his face red with shame. He didn't dare meet Victoria's eyes. Sheriff Moore stepped forward, addressing Victoria with genuine respect in his voice. "Colonel, I want to personally apologize for the behavior of my officer. His actions do not reflect the values of our department. I will personally ensure that this matter is handled properly." Victoria nodded her eyes, never leaving the officer as he stood before her. "You'd better," she said firmly. "This isn't just about me. It's about every person who's ever been made to feel small in a place. They should have been respected. Your actions today have consequences." The sheriff, his face tight with resolve, turned to Officer James once more. "Effective immediately." "Officer James, you are suspended from active duty pending an internal investigation. Your conduct will be reviewed, and further action will be taken." The young officer's face turned pale as he mumbled something indistinct, his shoulders slumping in defeat. He had no words left. As for Victoria, she didn't feel triumphant. She wasn't interested in revenge. What mattered to her was the principle standing up for what was right. Even when the odds seemed stacked against her, she had done that tonight, and she had made it clear that she wouldn't let discrimination go unchecked, no matter where it came from. Victoria took a deep breath, her posture relaxing slightly. As the atmosphere in the restaurant began to shift, the diners who had been watching her now seemed to understand that what had just transpired was bigger than any one individual. It was about justice, it was about humanity, and it was about respect. "I trust you will handle this appropriately," Victoria said, addressing Sheriff Moore. "One last time, I'm not looking for glory or recognition. I just want the world to be a little better than it was when I walked in here tonight." The sheriff nodded, clearly moved by her words. "I will, Colonel, you have my word," as Victoria turned and began walking toward the exit. The restaurant was silent, an uncomfortable silence, but one that spoke volumes. She had come in as just another diner, but she was leaving as a force to be reckoned with. Her calm and resolute actions had changed the course of the evening, and in a way the entire restaurant. The door to the outside world opened, and with it, Victoria Mason stepped into the cool night air, the city light shining above her. She wasn't done fighting, not by a long shot, but tonight she had made her stand, and that was enough for now.